The morning air in the Trinity Alps was crisp and thin, the kind of air that seemed to sharpen the senses and make the world feel both alive and secretive. The hiker, a man who had longed for solitude and freedom from the noise of everyday life, arrived at the trailhead before the sun had fully broken over the jagged peaks. His old sedan sat tucked away near the parking area, its trunk filled with the usual tools of a solo adventurer: extra fuel, a few supplies left behind, and maps he had studied for weeks. Neatly packed on his back was a weathered rucksack, tent, stove, food rations, water, compass, and a journal he always carried with him, believing that thoughts captured in the wild were worth more than those written at home. He was last seen by a pair of other hikers, who remembered him smiling, adjusting the straps of his pack, and mentioning he was looking forward to reaching the higher ridges where the stars burned brighter than anywhere else. He wasn't reckless, those who knew him said he was careful, someone who had spent years navigating trails alone, but there was always a risk in places like the Trinity Alps. The mountains there were raw, untouched in many ways, full of granite spires, hidden lakes, and valleys where a man could disappear without a trace. That first day, his footprints trailed off into the wilderness, clear enough in the soft dirt near the trailhead. He followed the narrow path that climbed steadily upward, the sound of rushing water from a nearby creek echoing through the trees. He stopped occasionally to drink, to rest, to scribble small notes in his journal about the way the light cut through the redwoods or how the scent of pine seemed stronger the deeper he went. Everything about his movements seemed ordinary, the routine of someone used to the rhythm of hiking. But somewhere along the way, the story shifts into uncertainty. When he didn't return after his expected trip, 2 days, maybe 3 at most, his family grew concerned. They tried to call, but his phone was off, likely tucked away since there was no service in those mountains. By the 5th day, worry turned to fear, and by the 7th, the authorities became involved. Rangers drove out to the trailhead and found his car untouched, locked, and coated with a thin layer of dust as though time had already begun to bury it. Inside, there was nothing unusual, no note, no clue as to why he hadn't come back. Search teams spread out, their voices carrying through the trees, calling his name again and again. Dogs caught faint trails of his scent near the lower paths, but it ended abruptly at a shallow stream where the rocks made tracking impossible. Helicopters hovered above, scanning with infrared at night, but found nothing. Not a body, not a backpack, not even clothing snagged on a branch. The only fragments left behind were puzzling. A corner of a map, torn and damp, found wedged between stones near a ridge. A boot print that seemed to veer suddenly off the marked path and into denser, more unforgiving terrain. And a small pile of stones that looked as though someone had sat and rested, though no one could confirm if it had been him. Days turned into weeks, and the search widened until it felt as though the whole mountain had been combed through. Yet there was no trace of him, no sign of a struggle, no evidence of an accident. It was as if the earth itself had opened and swallowed him whole. Locals whispered about the forest's reputation, that strange things sometimes happened there, that the mountains did not always give back what they took. For the family, the silence became unbearable, the unanswered questions heavier than any truth they could imagine. By the end of that summer, the case was officially marked as unresolved. The trail where he had last been seen grew quiet again, the sound of boots replaced once more by the whisper of wind in the pines. His car was eventually towed away, leaving no reminder at the trailhead of the man who had once walked into the Trinity Alps and vanished into its shadows. It was the beginning of a story that would linger like fog in the valley, waiting for the day when some piece of him, or of what happened, would be uncovered. The days after his disappearance stretched into a blur of desperation and exhaustion. His family, who had driven up from hours away, clung to the hope that he was simply delayed, maybe trapped somewhere with an injury, waiting to be found. They set up camp near the trailhead, a makeshift headquarters with folding chairs, coolers, and a constant stream of maps spread across car hoods. Volunteers, friends, locals, and strangers who felt drawn to the story arrived with backpacks, radios, and determination etched into their faces. The forest, vast and indifferent, loomed over them all, its silence broken only by the drone of helicopters overhead and the sharp barks of search dogs straining against their leashes. Teams ventured out at dawn, fanning across ridges and valleys, calling his name until their voices cracked. The sound echoed back, hollow and mocking, as though the woods were swallowing their pleas. Some carried whistles, blowing them at intervals, waiting for an answering call that never came. At night, they returned to camp weary and empty-handed, their boots caked with mud, their clothes damp from sweat and mist. Each day felt heavier than the last, as if the forest itself were resisting their efforts. Pieces of him seemed to appear and vanish in cruel fragments. A ranger found a page from a notebook snagged in a bush, the ink blurred by rain but words still faintly visible. Observations of birds, a mention of a sunset, nothing alarming, yet strange in its placement so far from where he was expected to be. A searcher discovered what looked like boot prints near a ridge, only for them to disappear abruptly where the ground turned rocky, as though the hiker had simply stopped existing past that point. By the third week, the clues began to feel less like leads and more like riddles left behind by the wilderness itself. The family grew restless. His brother refused to leave the mountains, spending hours pacing the trailhead, muttering that there had to be something everyone was missing. His mother sat in a folding chair with a blanket around her shoulders, staring at the tree line as if sheer willpower might bring him back out. His father, quiet and steady, joined the searches himself, trudging through gullies and over moss-slick rocks until his knees gave out. Grief hovered, but so did denial. The search dogs reacted strangely in certain places. Handlers noticed them freezing, hackles raised, growling into the trees at nothing visible. Some dismissed it as animal sense or the presence of bears, but others whispered that it was something else, something unseen, something the dogs sensed that humans could not. Stories began to spread among volunteers, voices carried on the wind, fleeting shapes darting between trees, feelings of being watched even when alone. The mountains had their own legends, of course, tales of spirits, of disappearances that had never been explained, but now they felt uncomfortably close. Rescue leaders remained practical, reminding everyone that the terrain was dangerous, steep cliffs hidden by brush, sudden drop-offs, icy streams that could sweep a man away. They checked caves, ravines, and deadfall, but still, there was nothing. No body, no campfire remains, not even scraps of clothing. It was as if the forest had conspired to erase him. After weeks of tireless effort, the official search was scaled back. Authorities explained that the resources were stretched too thin, that chances of survival after so long were nearly zero. The family protested, begged them to keep going, but eventually the professionals pulled out, leaving only a small circle of volunteers who refused to give up. By the end of the month, even those numbers dwindled. The camp at the trailhead was packed away, leaving behind tire tracks in the dirt and silence once more. The story slipped into rumor and memory. Locals spoke of him with lowered voices, some saying he had fallen, others suggesting he had run off to start a new life. But a few, those who had been deep in the search, confessed quietly that it felt wrong, different from an accident. They described the woods as unsettled during those weeks, restless, as though something was shifting just beyond their understanding. The hiker's name became part of the Trinity Alps whispered lore, a reminder that some who walk into the wilderness never return, and that not every disappearance has an answer. 5 years passed before the forest spoke again. Seasons rolled over the Trinity Alps in silence, snow sealing off the high trails each winter, wildflowers carpeting the meadows in spring, the rivers swelling and receding as though nothing had ever happened there. For most, the missing hiker was just another unsolved story tucked away in local lore, mentioned in passing around campfires or in quiet conversations at the diner in town. But for his family, the wound remained open, raw and unhealed, and for the mountains, the secret lay buried somewhere deep in their shadows. On an overcast morning in late autumn, a hunter ventured into those same woods. He was no stranger to the backcountry, a man who had spent decades chasing elk and deer through the steep valleys. The land was both familiar and unpredictable to him, a place he respected as much as he feared. That day he had risen early, packing light, his rifle slung across his shoulder, a small shovel tied to his gear for setting traps, and enough provisions for a long hike. Mist hung low, curling between the trunks like pale smoke, and the damp ground muffled his steps. He moved carefully, eyes scanning for tracks, ears tuned to the distant snap of branches. But the farther he walked, the more uneasy he felt. The forest seemed heavier here, the air thicker, every sound swallowed too quickly by the trees. He pressed on anyway, pushing deeper into the slopes where few hunters bothered to tread. That was where the game hid, he told himself. That was where the trophies lived. Hours later, as the light began to shift toward afternoon, he He stopped in a hollow surrounded by cedar and granite. The soil there was soft from recent rains, dark and rich, perfect for setting up a snare line. He dropped his pack, pulled out the small shovel, and began digging into the ground. At first the dirt gave easily, crumbling beneath each thrust of the blade. But then the metal edge struck something solid. The sound rang dull, not the clean clink of stone but a hollow resistance. He frowned, crouching lower, and brushed the soil aside with his gloved hands. What emerged wasn't rock or root. The corner of something man-made poked through, fabric, stiff and discolored with age. His pulse quickened. Carefully, he dug wider, revealing the crumpled remains of a pack half swallowed by earth. The straps had rotted, the buckles rusted, but it was unmistakably a backpack, buried deliberately as if hidden. For a long moment, he simply stared at it, the hairs on his neck prickling. He knew these mountains, knew their dangers, but stumbling upon a buried pack so deep in the wilderness sent a chill straight through him. He hesitated before tugging it free, the soil clinging as though reluctant to give it up. When it finally came loose, heavy and sodden, he sat back on his heels and let his breath steady. The hunter's first thought was practical. It could belong to another hiker, maybe someone who had camped out years ago. But then another thought wormed its way in, one that made his stomach tighten. The man who had vanished. The story he had heard whispered around town. The search that had ended with no answers. He remembered the details too well. The trailhead, the endless weeks of searching, the way people said the mountains had kept him. Holding the decayed pack, the hunter felt as though the forest itself was watching him, waiting to see what he would do. The mist curled tighter around the trees, the silence pressing in so heavy he could hear his own heartbeat in his ears. He didn't know yet what secrets lay inside, but he knew this was no ordinary find. The wilderness had finally given something back, and with it came the weight of all the unanswered questions from 5 years before. The hunter sat back on the damp ground, the weight of the rotted backpack resting across his knees. For a long while he didn't move, his breathing shallow, the mist curling low as if the forest itself held its breath. The fabric was frayed and stiff with soil, the zippers rusted to a dull brown. Every instinct told him to leave it where it was, to cover it back up and walk away, but curiosity gnawed at him, stronger than fear. With trembling fingers, he began to pry open the main pouch, working the corroded zipper until it gave with a reluctant snap. The smell hit first, a sour, earthy rot mixed with the faint tang of rust and mildew. Inside lay remnants of a life once carried proudly through these trails. A cooking tin dented and darkened, a bundle of nylon rope stiff with dirt, and a flashlight whose batteries had long corroded into powder. At first, it seemed like the ordinary belongings of any hiker left to decay with time, but deeper within the pack, the hunter uncovered something stranger. Wrapped in a brittle, water-damaged cloth was a small journal. Its cover had swollen from years of damp, the edges curling like dead leaves, but the binding held. He brushed mud from it and flipped it open. The first pages were legible enough, neat notes describing the scenery, sketches of mountain ridges, small reflections about the quiet beauty of the wilderness. The handwriting was steady, careful. But as he turned further, the words began to warp, written in frantic scrawls that slanted across the page. The tone shifted from admiration to unease. I hear something at night. Not animals. Heavier. Breathing. The forest feels wrong. My compass won't hold north anymore. Every time I look up, I feel like I've turned around. If anyone finds this, know that I tried to leave markers, but something is moving them. It doesn't want me out. The hunter's hand shook as he traced the smeared ink. The last entries were barely coherent, scrawled in trembling strokes that pressed so hard they tore the page. It's following me. No fire tonight. It's too close. If this is my last note, it's still out there. The hunter shut the journal, his skin cold despite the damp sweat clinging to his brow. He shoved it back into the pack and reached deeper, his fingers brushing against something sharp. He pulled out a hunting knife, its blade snapped jaggedly in half, as though broken against something harder than stone. The leather handle was worn and stained. The sight of it unsettled him more than the words in the journal. It felt like proof of a struggle, something violent, something real. And then he saw it. At the very bottom of the pack, half buried in soil that had seeped through, lay a pale shape. He froze, his breath caught in his chest. With hesitant hands, he lifted it free. A bone, long and thin, weathered but unmistakably human. Its surface was scarred with deep grooves, the kind left not by time or water but by teeth. The hunter dropped it instantly, his heart hammering. He stumbled back from the pack, his boots sinking into the damp earth, his eyes darting to the shadowed tree line as if expecting something to emerge. The forest had gone utterly silent. No birds, no insects, just the whisper of mist curling through the branches. For a moment, he considered leaving everything there, burying it again and walking away, pretending he had never seen it. But he knew he couldn't. The family of that hiker deserved answers, even if the answers were darker than anyone wanted to believe. With a trembling resolve, he gathered the journal, the broken knife, and even the bone, wrapping them in his jacket before stuffing them into his pack. He shouldered it quickly, his movements rushed, as though lingering too long would draw attention from something watching just beyond the veil of trees. As he left the hollow, every step felt like trespass. The mist thickened, the forest pressing in tighter with every mile. He didn't dare look back. He carried not just the weight of what he had found, but the crushing certainty that the missing hiker's final words were not the ramblings of a lost man, they were a warning. The hunter made it back to the trailhead just as dusk began to bleed across the sky, his chest tight with a pressure that had nothing to do with the long hike. He had carried heavy game before, antlers and meat strapped to his back for miles, but nothing had ever weighed on him the way that rotted backpack did. Every step toward civilization felt like a betrayal of the forest's silence, like he was dragging out something it had wanted buried forever. By the time he reached his truck, his hands were trembling too badly to fish for his keys. He sat there for a long while, staring at the bundle wrapped in his jacket, and wondering if he should drive straight home and burn it all. But deep inside, he knew he couldn't. There were families still waiting, questions that deserved answers, and a truth that felt too big to keep hidden. The sheriff's office was quiet when he walked in that night, carrying the bundle like a man hauling a corpse. The deputy at the desk frowned, standing quickly as the hunter laid it out. The air in the room seemed to shift when the bone rolled free, pale and unmistakable in the sterile light. Within minutes, the sheriff himself arrived, his expression caught between disbelief and grim recognition. The hunter explained everything, the digging, the backpack, the journal. His voice wavered only when he described the teeth marks scarring the bone, a detail that made the deputy go pale and look away. The evidence was sealed up and sent for testing, though it was already clear whose remains they belonged to. When the results came back days later, they confirmed the worst: the bone was human, and the DNA matched the man who had vanished 5 years before. The journal was preserved carefully, its entries transcribed page by page. Experts pored over the handwriting, noting the change in tone, the descent from steady observations into paranoia and terror. The final entries were almost unreadable, scrawled with a desperate hand, but they were enough to chill anyone who dared to interpret them. News spread quickly, and soon the case that had once gone cold ignited with new fire. Reporters descended on the small town, their cameras flashing as they asked impossible questions. What had killed him? Why had he buried his own pack? What stalked him in the woods, if anything at all? The family, though shattered by the confirmation of his death, clung to the journal as both a last connection and a haunting curse. His mother wept over the words, reading them aloud as though her son's voice could be resurrected through ink. His brother grew angry, demanding the sheriff keep the search open, insisting that whatever had hunted him might still be out there. Behind closed doors, the sheriff admitted the truth: he didn't know what to make of it. The broken knife suggested a struggle, but with what? The teeth marks on the bone did not match any local predator. They were too deep, too irregular, not the clean shearing of a cougar or the crushing bite of a bear. Some whispered they looked disturbingly human. But no one wanted to say it aloud. Locals began to murmur again, stories resurfacing about the Trinity Alps' reputation. Some spoke of strange figures seen moving between trees at twilight, of eerie cries echoing across valleys, of hunters who swore they had felt watched even in the stillest hours. Old legends returned with fresh weight, tales of creatures that lived in the wilderness long before settlers ever arrived, things that did not like to be disturbed. The hiker's journal, with its warnings about being followed, was treated not as the delusions of a lost man, but as testimony. For the hunter who had unearthed it all, peace never returned. At night he woke drenched in sweat, hearing again the silence of that hollow where he had dug, the way the forest had pressed in around him. He avoided those trails now, avoided the mountains altogether, though sometimes he swore he saw mist curling at the edge of his property, even on clear days. He told himself it was just memory, just guilt. But deep down, he feared the hiker had been right, that whatever stalked him was not gone, and that by disturbing the grave the forest had made, he had invited it to follow. And so the Trinity Alps kept their secret still, giving back only enough to haunt those who searched too deeply. The man who vanished was no longer just a story whispered around campfires. He had left behind his words, and with them a warning written in trembling hand: it's still out there.